Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
We are going to start at the beginning of the Parasha and move with some rapidity through the first parak. To bring us actually all the way up to the end of the chapter. We are picking up where we left off 2 weeks ago, right? Because last week was the Shabbos of Pesach. So we're still continuing this detailed journey through the various rites of the ancient Israelites. And we are, if we scroll back up a little bit, we can sort of remind ourselves that we're talking about this process through which the sacrificial service that they're engaging in the desert is being dedicated, is being engaged with. And it sort of continues through the beginning of this chapter, right? Like I said, we're going to buzz through it relatively quickly. There's not a lot happening narratively beyond the fact that is happening. On the eighth day, Moshe calls Aharon and his sons, and Ziknei Israel, the elders, and he says, like, here are the sacrifices that you need to undertake in order to, like, complete this process, basically. There's a lot of conversation, if we were to dive into the very, very beginning of the Parsha, there's a lot of conversation about the number 8 as opposed to the number of 7, right? 7 is a number of completion, 8 is pushing beyond that. 7 days of the week, 8 days of Brit Milah, you did the Seder last week, you know one, and so on and so forth. And taking these animals, taking a calf, taking a ram, bring them before God, taking the goat, taking the calf, just laying out the different offerings that need to be made in order to complete this process. And I'll just highlight in verse 4, in terms of what's going to be happening as a result of this experience. At the end of verse 4, Ki hayom Adonai nir'eh aleichem, that this is the day in which God will appear, will make manifest before you. So with that in mind, with that as sort of the goal and the anticipated outcome, everybody sort of takes direction and does their thing, right? They bring forth these offerings. Again, Moses reiterates in verse 6, yes, this is what God has commanded you to do, that God's presence, slightly different language, which will recur in our verses, Kavod Adonai will appear to you. There's some very interesting stuff that I stumbled along in verse 6 over the course of the week that I shared a little bit with Rabbi Schatz, because it seems to be both redundant and vague, which, as we know from our learning together, invites lots of midrashic opportunities. Maybe, what do you think, Rabbi Schatz? Should we do that one next year? We'll do that one next year. Okay. We did not have the easiest time picking the verses for this week, but we made it, and here we are. Okay. Moshe says to Aaron, come forward, you're going to sacrifice these offerings, and from here, it's a pretty straightforward recounting of this ritual. Aaron comes forward and offers the sacrifice of the calf, starts moving some blood around. Elon is very happy to hear about it. The various organs are laid out. We don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details. This is the fairly gross part. Rabbi Schatz, do you want to get into the weeds of the different body parts and all that? Nope, you don't? Okay, so we'll fast forward through this a little bit. Details of the service and so on and so forth, bringing us to the end of the parak for the most part. That was 10 verses of pretty bloody and detailed recounting of sacrifices. Extra credit if you can recount it in detail on your own time. Okay, verse 22. So after all of this is done, after all of these sacrifices have been offered, Aaron comes forth to the people. He lifts his hands. This probably rings a bell when you think about the imagery of what priests would do. He lifts his hands for the people, and he blesses them. Then he steps down after having offered that after offering this set of sacrifices. So we've gone through this whole process. Aaron comes out and he blesses the people after seemingly having brought this experience to a close. That's where we get to, and we're going to zoom in, literally and figuratively, on the last two verses of the chapter, I'm saying that word intentionally. Vayivot Moshe v'Aharon el Ohel Moed. So after all of that was done, Moses and Aaron come to the tent of meeting, come to the Ohel Moed. Then they come out. Okay, they went in, they went out. What happened there? V'yivarchu et ha'am, and they blessed the people. Interesting, given what just happened in the last verse. Vayira kavod Adonai el kol ha'am, and then, as was hinted at earlier in the chapter, that's the point at which the presence of God appears before all of the people. Verse 24, Vatitze esh milifnei Adonai, and then a fire came forth from God. Vatochal al mizbeach et olav et chalvim, and the fire basically like consumed the parts that it's supposed to consume as a part of the service, right? Like that part of the experience has now been activated. The fire consumes those sacrifices. Vayar kol ha'am, and all the people saw it. Vayaronu, and it's translated here as shouted. Rabbi Schatz, I don't know if you explored that word at all, but there's some conversation about what that word may or may not mean. Vayiplu al pneihem, and they fell on their faces, which is a motif and action that we see in a couple of different contexts within the Torah, and also can mean a couple of different things in terms of what it signifies. I'm going to say 1.5 more things before I throw the metaphorical ball over to Rabbi Schatz, who will no doubt catch it with grace and ease, which is to say that we are not going to be talking about the narrative piece that you probably know most well from this parsha, which is what happens in the next 2 psukim, which is the story of Nadav and Avihu and how they are consumed by fire. Not going to talk about that today, but it's interesting to know that it's right around the corner. Like it's literally the next verses, which is particularly interesting given that there's a big difference in how these verses are divided when you talk about chapters and when you talk about aliyah. If you look at the chapters, verse 24 is the last verse of chapter 9. If you look at the aliyah breakdown, the last verse of the second aliyah is verse 23, and the first verse of the third aliyah is verse 24, which then moves into the rest of the narrative with Nadav and Avihu. So it's very interesting, right? Where we pause in a story tells a lot about how the story is being told. So it's interesting for me to think about how there's a difference in division in terms of whether these verses are part of one unit or whether verse 23 is the end of experience 1, right? The dedication of that. And then verse 24 is the start of the next story regarding Nadav and Avihu. Rabbi Schatz.
And Rabbi Schatz will be talking about that tomorrow in her text study. So you can hear more about that tomorrow.
Spoiler alert.
What?
I said spoiler alert.
Oh, spoiler alert, yes. Actually not focusing so much on that part of the story, but kind of what comes next.
No spoiler.
Okay. Any kushiyot on these 2 verses here? Though Rabbi Shapiro and I gave you a little bit of what's to come next, let's try to focus on these particular verses since that's what we're going to be focusing on in our teaching. But obviously feel free to ask any questions that are on your mind. We might just not address them if they move beyond these 2 verses. Elon.
So it would be the more logical ordering would be fire came forth from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering, and the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people. So when they talk about kavod Adonai, presence of the Lord, you would, if you read it in that order, you would say, oh, they saw the fire coming out and that's the presence of the Lord. But it's not. I'm curious as to what is, when they say they saw the presence of the Lord, what does that mean? What manifestation said, that's the presence of the Lord?
Great. Wonderful, wonderful question. Renee.
I'm wondering did they shout and fall on their faces because of what they saw as far as the burnt offerings, or because of Hashem?
Great. So was it because of the kind of pomp and circumstance, or was it because of the God either making them do that or them being in the presence of God.
Right.
Barbara.
Well, the first thought that I had was, are there, when reading through this, as Rabbi Shapiro did, was a thought that I've had in the past, and that is, are there any midrashot about how the altars were cleaned? And then we come to 24, and it says the fire consumed the burnt offerings and the fat parts on the altar. So was there a fire after every time that blood and fat were thrown on the altar in order to keep it clean? Because when you read these things and when you get into other offerings, the altar had to be a horrible mess.
Yeah.
But was it fire that consumed it, or are there other midrashot that tell us how the altars were cleaned? They had to have done something to clean them, I would think. So that's my
it's a really good point, and one that I've not spent much time thinking about. And I don't know if there are midrashim on the way in which the altar was cleaned or not. But it's a really interesting and very creative way of thinking that potentially the reason that a fire came forth was for exactly that, to kind of start it again with a clean slate, as opposed to having the remnants from whatever sacrifice came before still on the altar. So I would have to look more into that. I don't know if Rabbi Shapiro knows more about it, but it's a very creative and very a very interesting way of thinking about what the fire was for and how the altar kind of got reset every time.
I definitely don't know much more about it specifically. I do know that I would not want to be a janitor in the Ohel Moed.
Yes, correct. Yes. Thank you for that addition. We wouldn't have been able to move on without it. Jay.
My question is, would this be the first time that the Israelites actually witnessed a sacrifice?
Without knowing every line of Torah by heart, I would assume yes, because now the Mishkan is ready for use. It wasn't ready for use before. It was being built. It was being considered a holy space. But most likely this was the first time, might not have been the first sacrifice, but it was most likely the first time that it was a communal experience, at least in this way, around a tabernacle and in the Mishkan itself. But again, I'm not 100% sure that's correct, but given context, I would bet on it that this is the first time. Rebecca.
So my question is sort of a continuation of Barbara's question, at least in my mind. And I know you don't really want to talk about the different body parts, but I noticed this also in the week we did Purim. Why is there a separation between the offering and the fatty parts, and whether there's a risk, because they end up doing the same things.
Right.
They put them in the same place, they burn them, but somehow there's a separation there between something that is considered the burnt offering and then the fat parts, which also burn. So I'm wondering if that is something that is sort of known from the neighborhood in terms of sacrifice, or if there's something else there.
Yeah. So in terms of, I'll give a very brief answer, and I actually don't know if these two things are connected or if what I'm about to share came after based on your question. In terms of the laws of kashrut, the idea of limbs are very different than the idea of fat of an animal, or really anything else, like blood, obviously, but also this stuff called chelev, which is what's the word in English? Unfit or unused, whatever, type of fat. I can't think of another English word. Type of fat for when you're talking through an animal and what parts of an animal are actually able to be either sacrificed or eaten when we get to the laws of kashrut, which are also in this parsha. So that's my guess of why they're separated. But again, I don't know, like chicken or the egg. I don't know if they're separated out because we know later on they're going to be separated in terms of what can be useful, or if they're now separated out as what can be useful because of the question that you just asked, which is they're separated from the beginning. So it's a very interesting point, and that would be my only guess, but I don't know factually why that happened. Rabbi Shapiro, do you have any thoughts on that? Or any words for the word that I still can't think of in English? No? Okay. All right, Joanna.
There is sort of an interesting interplay between these two psukim that I think is a little bit lost in the English translation around the words vayera and vayar, which are the same root in Hebrew, right? So, vayera kvod Adonai el kol ha'am, God's presence appeared, and then vayar kol ha'am, the people saw. And the other question that I have is, when the people shouted, what is it that they shouted? And it takes me to the following words, that they fell on their faces. And from the Avodah service on Yom Kippur, we know that when they fell on their faces, what they said was, Baruch Shem Kavod Adonai. Blessed is, Kavod Adonai. And that's resonating with me here because of the Kavod Adonai in verse 23. So, and just, is that what they said, or just trying to imagine what was their response? What did they say? The text doesn't seem to tell us.
Yeah, in rabbinical school, I actually wrote a whole paper on the different places in which it uses Vayiplu al Pneihem. Most of the time
That sounds like a really cool paper.
Oh.
I was wondering, I was going to try to look that up before the class, but I figured it'd be too difficult. I should have known Rabbi Schatz.
I don't remember what class I wrote it for, but I wrote it for one of the classes. And most of the time when it comes up, it's in moments of prayer. But then the other times that it comes up is exactly this kind of situation, which you're referring to as kind of connected to the way that we use it on Yom Kippur, which is kind of in awe and in reverence of God who's before us. I obviously don't know what they shouted. That's not obvious. I don't know what they shouted. But it does seem as though they are falling on their faces because they're just so awestruck with this moment, whether, again, going back to Elon's point, whether that's because of this sacrifice that just happened or because they're now in the presence of God. I think that was Elon. It was earlier on. I thought that was Elon. Yeah. But maybe we'll get to that in some of the commentaries. I didn't focus as much on 24, but maybe Rabbi Shapiro has some stuff. Bonnie, I almost called you Larry. Bonnie and then Nancy.
So I was struck by the fire came forth from before the Lord, because in the previous Pesukim, there was fire already there.
Yeah.
Because things went up in smoke. So did the priests light that fire? And then what is different about this fire that came from God?
Yeah, so Rabbi Sharif, if you can just scroll up to 22 also, great. So what we see here, we don't actually see the fire in this one line, but as Bonnie's saying, it comes before. But what we do see is there's a lot of repetition here, right? There's two prayers. That's what I'm going to be talking about. There's two prayers that are happening here. The fire was already there. Why does it need to now be started again? So as you're pointing out, Bonnie, was it that different people had different access to these moments, or was it that it actually happened twice, right? That something occurred, either went out or was used and then occurred again. Yeah, we don't know, but the repetition, as you're pointing out, is quite interesting. And as we know from Rabbi Sean Fieldsmeyer, the Torah has an economy of language. So the fact that it is written this way was intentional. Nancy.
So I'm wondering about the relationship between the tent of meeting and blessing people. Like, because it comes first, is it necessary to be inside this tent of meeting before you can bless people? Or, what is it about that?
Great. Yeah, it seems that that sentence could have been left out had it not been important for the blessing to have come after they were in the tent of meeting. It is also interesting to add on to your kushia that they had to come out of the tent of meeting in order to bless. So was there a moment of them receiving their own blessing or finding their own moment of prayer or spirituality inside that then they had to experience to be able to bring back out? We will talk a little bit about that, but it seems to be that the location is important. We'll put it that way. Rabbi Shapiro?
If you want to, that seems like a good segue to verse 23. If you want to take that and run with it.
Okay. Yeah, I can talk a little. I focused on verses 22 and 23 a little bit more than 23 and 24.
Rabbi Schatz.
Yeah, breaking all the rules, but we create the rules, so we get to break them. Because my main kushia was similar to this question of repetition. My main kushia was in verse 22. It says that Aaron lifted his hands towards the people and blessed them. And then in verse 23, it says they came out, they blessed the people. So what are the verses just out of order? Were there two different blessings? Why were there two different blessings? Why is it important that we know that they both happened, right? Again, if everything being written down is supposed to be important for us to take into account, were these two blessings then different, that we need to know that they both happened? Were they different, or were they just recounted in two different ways? So those were my kushiot, and I found a lot, as you can see as I'm scrolling, I found a lot of commentaries, but this is the one that I want to share that was kind of my favorite. And then I'll pass it over to Rabbi Shapiro, and if we want to go back to this topic, we can, but I don't want to spend too much time on verses that we didn't agree on. So
that's 23, you're good.
Yes, that's true. It's based on 22, but yeah. So this is the Orach Chaim on verse 23, commenting on Vayitzu Vayivarechu, that they came out and then they blessed. So actually kind of back to this question of the tabernacle. Why is the location important? Perhaps they had been commanded to do so by a prophetic vision. It is also possible that the Torah substitutes the word blessing here for the word prayer, which also goes back to the idea of Vayiplu al panav, that they fell on their faces, that was potentially another type of prayer that then the people took on after this blessing. Or after this prayer. The prayer may have been that God's presence should continue to manifest itself in the camp. Even though the people had already been blessed by Aaron, right? So the Orach Chaim is picking up on the fact that this was the second time this had happened. It was good to be blessed by both brothers, each of whom represented a different nuance of spirituality. One that is unique to the Levite, sounded weird coming out of my mouth, and the other, the spirituality unique to the priesthood. In Kabbalistic terms, I didn't even realize that there was a Kabbalistic thing at the end here.
You started reading this, I was like, Rabbi Schatz, do you realize what you did?
I didn't read the last sentence. And in Kabbalistic terms, the two brothers, Aaron and Moshe, represented the emanations, Chesed v'Gvura, respectively. Okay, we're not going to talk about that, which is probably why I didn't read it.
You could.
I couldn't actually. But what I really enjoyed from this commentary is that it wasn't necessarily, well, let's go back to the verse so that you can see it in the text itself. What the Orach Chaim is noticing here is that in the first verse in Leviticus 9:22, it's just Aaron, right? And going back to what Rabbi Shapiro mentioned before, right after this, Aaron has no words left. So it's interesting that Aaron, before his sons are killed, he has two blessings to offer. And then the real tragedy over his children dying, takes away his ability to do any of that kind of blessing, which understandably, obviously, but interesting that so much of this comes before him. So Aaron lifted his hands towards the people, but then in the next verse in 9:23, Moses and Aaron then blessed the people. And what I find very profound and what the Orach Chaim is bringing up is that it's not important whether or not there were two blessings. What's important is that one blessing came from one person and the other blessing came from another two people. So when you get a blessing, right? When I can stop sharing this now. When I do a bar or bat mitzvah, I'm going to give a very different blessing than Rabbi Kligfeld might give that bar or bat mitzvah kid. That's not because the kid is any different, but our relationship to the kid is different. Our way in working with the kid is different. Our way of rabbiing is different. Our way of blessing is different. And what seems to be important to the Or HaChaim to mention here is that the people deserved not just a blessing from Aaron, but also a blessing from Moshe, that they deserved to kind of receive as much blessing as they possibly could, as opposed to just blessing from one of them. It would have been good enough, right? Going back to the idea of Dayenu, it would have been good enough for them to just get a blessing from Aaron. He was a wonderful, definitely a better orator than Moshe, right? He was very able to give a blessing, and a beautiful one at that. But Moshe had different things to say to the people, and Moshe had a different heart to share with them in this blessing. So I loved that my question of why two blessings kind of changed perspective by reading this commentary by the Or HaChaim, because it seems like the question of why two is less important than the question of why Aaron and then why Moshe and Aaron together. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay. Rabbi Shapiro?
I mean, to dive into the part that you don't want to dive. I mean, I think most folks probably, right, in Kabbalah, there's like the 10 sfirot, which are considered to be like different ways in which God manifests in the world, right? Think about it like food coloring, right? Like the water's the same, but the color is going to look a little bit different. It's not that it's different, but it's a different way of appearing in the world. What's interesting is that Aaron is often affiliated with chesed, is like loving kindness and like gentleness and so on and so forth. I was quickly looking just now. I don't think, interestingly, and I'm sure the Or HaChaim knows the Sfirot better than I do, I don't think Moshe is usually necessarily associated with Gevura, which is like strength and might. And when you think about the Sfirot, they're like two sides and there's the center, and those two counterbalance each other, right? So Gvura and Chesed, they're each is needed, right, to keep balance, but they're like two sort of like opposites to wrote in that way. But all of that, I mean, informs, Rabbi Schatz, what you're saying in terms of how, right, all of that is just underscoring what you're saying, right? That different people offer different perspective, different way of being, different words, the more blessings, the better, right? Like it's all helpful,
and
right?
And different things to be heard, because I think that also one of the blessings of working in a place with multiple rabbis is that you also might listen better to a certain kind of teaching or a certain kind of blessing. And that's not to say that the other kind is not good or valuable, but you just might be drawn towards a certain kind, in this case, of blessing, that if Moshe and Aaron can do it together, then you get both, and you don't have to worry that Aaron's blessing didn't speak to you or didn't make you think differently in a way that Moshe's would.
Yeah. And Joanna, you took the words out of my mouth that you put in the chat. Like Joanna said in the chat that, you know, for those who don't know, one way in which you can like add depth to your ritual of counting the Omer, which we are now in the middle of, is that you can infuse that with 7 of the Sfirot over the course of the 49 days, and that like there's a specific sphira or like trait or way of being that you're working to cultivate that week. And there's a way of like infusing each of the 7 within the 7, right? So day 1 is chesed shebechesed, right? Loving kindness within loving kindness. Day 2 is vura shebechesed, right? The way in which you need to hold boundaries within your loving kindness, and so on and so forth. But yes, we are still in week 2, and the trait for this week is gevura. The other thing I'll add on verse 23, it's related, although it's sort of the locus of it is a narrative half step before the blessing piece, which picks up on something, Rabbi Schatz, that you're noting, which is like the double blessing, or like we were talking about towards the end of the Kushiot, is like the back and forth, and why is it necessary to do it more than once? And there's a midrash. Rashi picks up on the midrash in his comment, but it begins in the midrash in the Sifra, which is a collection of midrashim that goes through Vayikra pretty comprehensively, basically asking the question of why did they go in there together? Why was it Moshe and Aaron? And what's interesting, like foregrounding / side note before getting into the content of the midrash, there's a really interesting like thread of rabbinic commentary and thought on like the inner spiritual life of Aharon post golden calf. There's like a lot of really interesting rabbinic comments on reflections on Aaron's wrestling with and struggle with like being a spiritual leader on the heels of that experience that I've seen peppered around over the course of time. And I hadn't seen this before, but to me it seems in line with that. The Midrash says that like when Aaron saw all these offerings, but the Shekhinah still hadn't descended on Israel, right? Like we did everything we're supposed to do, like the sacrifice checklist, right? You got everything off the grocery list from the butcher, as it were. What, Rabbi Shap? That's what it is.
Except for not liver. And if you want to get people going down a really fun rabbit hole of liver, just mention the word liver and you will have every woman on this call yelling at you about how you can't find liver any longer. But don't actually say it, and don't anybody start, Barbara. Don't anybody start. Okay, Rabbi Shapiro, go.
Is that like the surprise code word of the day? Like on
No. We just had a class yesterday and we went down a very long rabbit hole with very passionate speaking about liver. And
I will say that we found pre-made chopped liver for Pesach.
No. We need to just.
So if anyone has good homemade chopped liver, I'd love some, because I didn't get any over Pesach.
Move on.
So you're telling me I should talk about liver some more.
I will leave. So if you would like to talk about liver, I'm gonna go teach.
They checked everything off the grocery list, which may or may not include liver. They got everything they get, and it still hasn't worked, right? Everything that has been teased earlier on in the chapter, like the presence of God button, still hasn't been activated in terms of what's supposed to be happening. And the Midrash tells us that then Aaron was having a rough time, that he stood and grieved. I know that God's angry with me, and because of me, God hasn't descended on Israel. So I entered, and I was put to, and this is what Moses did this to me, which is very interesting. Moses did this to me. I entered, I was put to shame, and God did not descend on Israel. Which is a fascinating, right? Like we definitely don't get like that kind of voice to the internal experience of a character in the Torah, really ever in the Torah, or very infrequently. And the Midrash is like filling in this gap. And then what it says is then Moses entered with him. They asked for mercy. The Shekhinah descended on Israel. And so that's why Moses and Aaron went into the Ohel Moed, into the tent of meeting. I think it's such a fascinating narrative interpolation to bring that in, right? That like little narrative lacuna in terms of like, well, why are they going back and forth? And Aaron was just in there, and why is Moses in there too? In terms of really delving into a potential psychological sense of what's going on with Aaron on the heels of the experience with the golden calf, right? And we all have this, right? Like if I've done something wrong, even if what happens next, like what happens tomorrow or next week, has nothing to do with it, if I'm still holding on to that, I might have the perspective of, well, I know why that's happening. It's because I did such and such, right? I'd imagine other folks can relate to that as well. I certainly can. I think it's a really wise psychological insight to be infused in the Midrash. And some blame, right? Some blame there in terms of, and it's because of Moshe, like he put me up to it. He's still mad at me because of, and then there's then real healing there, which is then like, for like there's like a narrative irony there, given that we also know the tragedy that lies literally just around the corner. But the fact that within this specific moment of Midrash, that there's that moment of healing where Moshe and Aharon are in the tent together, and they both reach out to God, and they come out and they bless the people, and that's when this experience happens. I really love the Midrash and how it like fills in that gap in a really interesting way that I hadn't seen before. So it was a pleasure to come across that piece. I really enjoyed it.
Are there any other pieces that you want to share that go into verse 24?
I have a few. I mean, yeah, I don't know if you had seen that Midrash. I don't know if folks have thoughts on that Midrash. I have a little bit on 24 in terms of the fire and the face falling and the what have you. But
got it. I had not seen the Midrash.
Isn't it great?
Yeah. Similar to a lot.
You don't like it. Oh, you don't like it.
No, I didn't say that. Similar to a lot of things that you share without me being able to look at them.
Visual learner. Everybody mark it off your bingo cards. Mark it off your exploring the Parsha bingo cards. Visual learner.
Can you just let me finish my sentence? I would just have to read it through again to figure out if I would like it or not. I think it goes deeply into something that I agree with, and I like the premise of it, but I had not heard it or read it.
Meanwhile, Elon's talking about Portnoy's complaint in the chat and the liver. So, Elon, do you know I just read Portnoy's complaint 2 years ago. I've just read it for the first. I hadn't.
So then the liver scene is fresh in your mind.
Yeah, unfortunately. Thank you.
Only to be compared with the baseball glove scene.
This podcast, if it goes any further, will have a content advisory.
Instead of us gaining listeners, I think we're losing them. But
that implies we have listeners to begin with.
We do. Bert Kleinman tells us about them every week. So,
hello, listeners.
I will say one more thing about, and then I'll let Rabbi Shapiro do his pieces and close it out. But I want to add, like, this is like a feel good piece. There's not really, not much more to take away from it, but because many of you know the priestly blessing, I really like that this commentary speaks to chapter 9, verse 22, that the fact that his hands went out, that somehow our commentators, Rashi also believes that this was actually the priestly blessing that Aaron gave, that was the specific blessing, whereas when Moshe and Aaron gave a blessing together, it was a little bit more personalized and a little bit more of like that bar bat mitzvah blessing that I was mentioning before, personal to the people, less written beforehand. And interesting that we, as we say very fondly of our Torah, there is nothing early or late in the Torah, but the priestly blessing comes later on in the Torah than this piece of narrative. But the Kitzur Bal HaTurim says the three blessings of the Kohanim, and he blessed them with the three blessings of the Kohanim, and they correspond to the three types of offerings, which I think is quite interesting. The first blessing corresponds to the sin offerings, the word Vayishmerecha, from sin, as it says in Shmuel 1, the feet of God's pious ones, God will guard them. And then Ya'er Adonai Panav Elecha corresponds to the burnt offering, as it says, when you go up, you will seek peace, and that corresponds to the peace offering. Interesting that they don't go to the third one. So saying that all three of these correspond to the three blessings of the three types of offerings is interesting that that doesn't go to the third, but you get the idea here and Rashi says it in a little more plain language, so though I won't read it, I'll just show it to you, that this idea of blessing that Aaron goes through is a blessing that we all know very well. And maybe it was then important to Aaron and Moshe to make sure that there was yet another blessing that was a little bit more personalized, because the priestly blessing was something that everybody knew and everybody kind of just accepted upon themselves, like children when they hear it on Shabbat, they know it's coming. But to then hear a personalized blessing meant a little bit more to the people. So I just wanted to connect that to something that you already know and something that is probably connected to you in some kind of also emotional way of like remembering when your parents said to you, remembering when you said to your kids, or remembering when it's said at life cycle events that you've attended. So just wanted to bring that in. That's lovely. I never like there's nothing early or late in the Torah because I think it's baloney, but I like that. Well, for a commentator, there isn't, right? Because the commentator knows the whole Torah. So he knows, the Kitzer knows, but, Yeah. But it's lovely. Agreed. Okay. I wanted to pick up, it's briefly because it's a brief thought. Well, it might not be a brief thought, but I'll be mindful of the time. It does connect back with what we were talking about 2 weeks ago. Because 2 weeks ago we were talking about the Eish Tamid, so we're going to talk about fire a little bit to close things out, to circle back. Oh, that's what you were talking about. Rabbi Shapiro said to me yesterday, weren't we talking about fire recently? And I just kind of nodded and said yes, but I had no idea what he was talking about. You were talking about the Eish Tamid. Got it. Yes, we were talking about that recently. Now I can respond to the question. Great. Let it be noted that Rabbi Schatz how many of these have we done? Rabbi Schatz finally knows what I'm talking about. We made it. Jay, you made such, I think, it's something that I knew, but there was something in the way that you framed it that I think shed a really beautiful light, pun now intended, on what this experience was like for the Israelites. Like, this was really their first time experiencing something like this, again, like going to this idea of like putting ourselves in the state of mind and in the perspective of like what this was like for, Yosef Kaf Israelite, in terms of what it was like to experience what was going on here. The language itself, I'll pull it back up for the visual learners in the group. In terms of what it says, the valence of these phrases, is ambiguous, right? When it says vayaronu, it's not that common of a word. So there's, of course, some conversation about what that is. And the vayiplu al pneihem, and they fell on their faces, as our resident expert in face falling shared with us. There can be, a couple of different understandings of what's going on there when folks do something like that. So I just think it's interesting, going into this perspective of, I'm seeing this for the first time. I've never seen something like this before. Like, yeah, they've left Israel. They saw the signs and the wonders, but they haven't necessarily seen an experience like this coming out of like a specific ritual, right? That's still a different kind of experience. And it was interesting to see, not surprisingly, given the way our tradition works, but there's a few folks who said in the Sifra. So I was looking at Sifra a good deal. The Sifra said like two different ways in which they were talking about how this was like a good thing, that this, like, they connected the idea of vayaronu to like rina, like joy and singing or happiness, right? The sense that this was actually, it wasn't necessarily that they shouted, like they were excited, they were happy, they sang at this. But Ibn Ezra goes in the other direction. He says, but he connects it with a pretty brutal passage from the Book of Kings in terms of like a cry going out through the people, that they were scared, that they were fearful, that they actually weren't particularly happy about this. Rabbeinu Bachia, in addition to explicitly connecting this fire back to very much what we were talking about 2 weeks ago in terms of the Eish Tamid and how this specific fire burned for a long time, he talks about how there are times in our history when I'll just read what he says. He says that there are various times in our history that there have been 12 recorded occasions when fire descended from heaven. 6 of these occasions were for the sake of accepting sacrificial offerings. The other 6 occasions were demonstrations of divine displeasure and anger. Right? So it's you see fire from heaven,
you're 50-50 on whether it's going to be a very good day or a very, very bad day. But that there's two different things being, like, experiences being indicated with that same thing happening, with completely different outcomes. And I think it's interesting to, like, I'll try to, like, wrap a bow on this in terms of there's these three different components of this verse. I'll say it like that. Three different components of this verse that it's kind of like the same thing, but with a potentially very different valence. This vayaronu, that it could be joy or it could be yelling. This idea of vayiplu al pneihem, falling on their faces, could be out of prayer or gratitude or whatever that might be, or out of fear, anxiety, wanting to hide. And so too with the fire itself, that it could be something that is, like we see it here, and Bach says that it is this is one of the good ones, right? This is one of the good ones where the offering is being accepted. But, like, again, and he hints at this in his comment, like, turning the corner, he cites very specifically that in that next verse that we all know is coming, even though we're not there yet, but we all know it's coming, that it is one of the examples of it being a consuming fire out of anger. So it's interesting to me when we think about spiritual experience, when we think about this being the first time the Israelites have had something like this happen, right? Is it something that they're engaged in and joyful over and appreciative of and full of gratitude for, or is it something that's bringing them anxiety, fear, concern? Yes, right? My answer to that, based on all of those pieces, would be that I think it's very intentionally yes, that there's, like, a narrative dance happening there, that there's something in the lack of a clear valence in those verbs in terms of what's happening, right? What did they shout? What did they sing? What did they say? We don't know. And there's something in the not knowing of exactly what those words are that I think indicates a greater depth and spectrum of spiritual experience in terms of what that might be than we would have if the verse was more specific in terms of indicating what was happening there.
It's so interesting, because that is exactly what we experience in Aaron's response to his children's death, right? We experience, as opposed to it being a cacophony of emotions and reactions, it's lack of, but at the end of the day, those are actually exactly the same, because unless you're saying this is how the person reacted specifically, it's just a lot of something. So it's either a lot of silence or a lot of feelings. It actually reminds me a lot of one of your children, that when I asked him if he was excited to go to school this week, he said, yeah, and a little bit anxious. And I think that is, you can feel both of those things at the same time. And I actually believe that in Aaron's silence, and I might have to use this piece now for tomorrow morning, I actually believe in Aaron's silence that he wasn't not feeling anything, which some of our commentators say he felt numb, he felt nothing, he couldn't move on, but that he actually was feeling so much all at once that there was no way to express that in a meaningful way. And so there was just silence. And I don't know, it seems to me to be a mirrored reaction that you're referring to here in that, and the what is it? Yeah. I always think of Roni v'simchi, so I can never remember what the actual word.
Well, yeah, I mean, because that's one potential manifestation of. Yeah. Although, I mean, in some ways, it's exactly the opposite, right? You're saying the silence holds multitudes, and here it's the fact that it's being indicated that there's something that they're saying, but we don't know what it is, and because we don't know what it is, it's possible to read a wide spectrum of what's happening there into it, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think for anybody who's experienced loss or anybody who's experienced extreme elation, right? It's hard to express what's going on in that moment. It's when someone says, what can I do to help? The answer is often nothing, because you don't know how to be helped in a moment where you can't yet express how you are feeling or what you need. And those seem to be, again, as you're saying, like, they're obviously not the same. They're obviously actually opposites, but they seem to be similar ways in which the people and then Aaron are reacting.
Right, but it's not, and to pull it back to you broke your, Rabbi Schatz, you keep breaking the rules. You told everyone at the beginning of this that we weren't going to talk about the verses, and you're concluding by talking about those verses. You're breaking all the rules today, man. You're going crazy.
Wait, what? Weren't those the verses that we chose?
No, because you're talking about Aaron and his silence. That's exactly the opposite. You're going rogue, man.
No, I'm telling you about the verse that you just mentioned.
No, but you're going. So I'm going to pull it back to the verses.
Anyway.
I'm going to pull it back to the verses that were, because I'm a rule follower. Oh. I play by the rules.
Okay.
I take rules very seriously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say one thing in the wrap. What it makes me think of, I'm very excited, and it's 90 seconds. I'm very excited because one of the things I got for my birthday is I'm going to see a concert in November, which is a weird thing to get for a birthday in April, but it's at the Greek Theater. It's outside. It's a band that I want to see for a very long time. I love live music. I miss concerts. What this made me think of when you're talking about like words and not having words for something is when you see, I consider concerts to be a spiritual experience. Like it's music, you're with other people, it's communal, you're connected to something bigger than you. I experience spirituality, not at every show. Sometimes the band stinks, but like at a really good concert, like I consider that very much to be a spiritual experience. When I'm thinking about like something beyond work, like you go to a great concert, it's like, what do you say? It was awesome. It was great. It was so good. Like you don't have, right? We don't have language, right? There are things that transcend. Like what it made me think of is I went to a music festival. I went to I've been to Lowell. It was a couple of times. This was 2010. I think it was 2010. And the last band to play, this will not mean anything to anyone, but I'm going to say it anyway. The last band to close out the concert was Arcade Fire. Any Arcade Fire fans on the call? Okay. Oh, Jay, there we go. Thank you very much. Jay knows what I'm talking about. And Arcade Fire has a very, like, their most popular song, it's Wake Up, and it goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. You might have heard it on a commercial, blah, blah, blah. Rabbi Schatz, you got me singing on the podcast again, so you should be very happy. And it's like their biggest song. It closed out the festival. Everybody there knew it. And it was like the last thing, and they closed the concert, and that's it. And the lights are coming up, everybody's going home. And as everyone was leaving the festival, right? Festival's over. Everyone kept singing that together as they were walking out. Mm. It was awesome. Like filtering out to like buses, cabs, cars, walking home, like filtering back out into the city. People kept like singing that riff for a solid like 3, 4, 5 minutes. It was awesome. I've never seen anything like it. When you think about like what that experience can be, and going beyond words and being overwhelmed and not having the words but still carrying it with you, that's what that makes me think.
I will pull it all together by saying I think that one of the things that these verses remind us of is to be able to just be in a moment, right? To be able to listen to the moment that you're in, to experience the moment that you're in, to take the blessing that you're being given in that moment, but just to be present, because the people would not have had the reaction that they had they not been present in that moment, nor would they have felt the need to have a second blessing from Aaron and Moshe had they not been present in the moment to hear Aaron. So I hope for all of you that you are able to stay present in the moments that you are in, and to appreciate those moments and learn from them what you need for the moments to come.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.